A man sits alone in a sealed research room. On the table in front of him is a blank sheet of paper. He is given a target, but no description of what it is. He closes his eyes and begins to draw. First, a large circular shape, then faint bands across its surface. Then something unexpected, a thin ring surrounding it. The target was Jupiter. At the time, scientists believed the planet had no rings at all. 6 years later, Voyager 1 confirmed they existed. In 1973, the CIA began funding an experiment that sounded impossible. They wanted to know if the human mind could spy on distant locations. During the early years of the Cold War, U.S. intelligence agencies began receiving unusual reports from behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union was investing in research that had nothing to do with missiles, satellites, or conventional weapons. They were studying the human mind, telepathy, remote perception, and the idea of gathering intelligence without physical presence. American officials could not confirm whether the research was legitimate, exaggerated, or psychological propaganda. But in intelligence work, uncertainty can be more dangerous than a known threat. By the late 1960s, U.S. intelligence concluded the Soviet Union was actively funding what they called parapsychology research, and they could not afford to ignore it. So in 1973, U.S. intelligence initiated an experiment. A civilian was brought into a secure research facility. He was not a soldier, not a scientist, not an intelligence officer. He was an artist who claimed he could perceive distant locations without using his eyes. Officials were skeptical, but they tested him anyway. What began as a single control experiment would evolve into a classified program that lasted more than 20 years. This was Project Stargate. The origins of Stargate did not begin inside the Pentagon. They began at the Stanford Research Institute in California. But to understand why, you have to understand what American intelligence believed it was facing. The Soviet investment in psychic research was not a rumor, it was documented. American intelligence had been tracking Soviet paranormal experiments since the 1950s. By the 1970s, CIA analysts estimated Soviet spending had reached hundreds of millions of rubles annually. It was government funded and military directed, and their subjects were producing results that American analysts could not easily dismiss. One of them was a Soviet woman named Nina Kulagina. She was filmed in what were described as controlled laboratory conditions, apparently moving objects without physical contact, not once, but multiple times. She was observed by scientists, and she was recorded on film. The footage exists. American intelligence could not confirm the mechanism and could not replicate the results, but they could not ignore them either. If the Soviets had developed even a partial advantage in this area, every classified facility, every secured location, every military secret became potentially visible. The United States could not afford to find out too late. That context was what brought Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ into the picture. In the early 1970s, the two physicists were studying human perception at the Stanford Research Institute, specifically whether consciousness could detect information at a distance. Their work changed direction when a participant named Ingo Swann entered the program. Swann claimed he could describe distant locations he had never physically visited. Under controlled conditions, he was asked to observe targets using only coordinates. He produced sketches, shapes, structures, and environmental details. Many descriptions were vague and some were incorrect, but several appeared unexpectedly specific. In one experiment, Swan reportedly described characteristics of a sensitive monitoring device located inside a secure facility, information he had no known way of accessing. But the experiment that changed everything did not involve a classified facility. It involved a planet. In 1973, before any spacecraft had confirmed the existence of Jupiter's rings, Swan was given a set of coordinates and asked simply to describe what he perceived. What he produced shocked researchers. Swan described a ring system around Jupiter, details about the planet's environment that science had not yet confirmed. In 1979, Voyager 1 confirmed the existence of Jupiter's rings. The data Swan had apparently described years earlier, before any spacecraft had returned that information, was now in the public record. No widely accepted explanation has been established for how Swan described a feature of Jupiter that science had not yet confirmed. That result did not prove psychic ability, but it did something almost more unsettling. It raised a question that the program would spend 20 more years trying to answer. If this file is worth continuing, the subscribe button keeps the archive open. Intelligence agencies were not interested in proving psychic ability. They were interested in whether perception itself could become a tool. Participants sat alone in isolated rooms. No windows, no communication, no sensory input. They were given only numerical coordinates and asked to describe whatever existed at that location. This process was design-controlled remote viewing. Every session was recorded, every statement was transcribed, and every sketch was archived. Most sessions produced unusable information, impressions that were symbolic, incomplete, or incorrect, but occasionally, descriptions matched. Among the participants was Pat Price, a former police officer. In one session, Price was given only the geographical coordinates of a target inside the Soviet Union. No maps, no context, and no other information of any kind. He described a Soviet nuclear research facility in specific detail, underground structures, construction materials, and technical equipment he should not have known existed. Months later, satellite imagery appeared to confirm aspects of his description. Price had no known access to that information, no clearance, no connection to Soviet intelligence, and no explanation for what he appeared to know. For intelligence officials, that result carried weight that was difficult to dismiss. If accurate perception could occur without physical access, traditional secrecy meant nothing. By the late 1970s, the project shifted from academic research into operational testing. The program cycled through multiple classified names: Gondola Wish, Grill Flame, Center Lane, Sun Street. By the time oversight caught up, the program was already operating under another name. Each transition brought new oversight, but the funding never stopped. Eventually, responsibility transferred to the Defense Intelligence Agency. Remote viewers were assigned real intelligence targets, foreign weapons facilities, hostage situations, and underground structures. During the Iran hostage crisis, viewers were tasked with locating where the hostages were being held. These were not laboratory exercises. This had become an experimental intelligence unit running alongside conventional operations. Among the viewers was Joseph McMoneagle, later designated Remote Viewer 001. A series of sessions conducted over several weeks would become the most referenced in the program's history. He was given coordinates for an undisclosed Soviet location, nothing else. His descriptions were specific: a massive construction project, underground facilities, and a large vessel under construction unlike anything in the known Soviet inventory. Analysts were skeptical, and the session was filed. Months later, satellite imagery returned data from that location. A new class of Soviet submarine was under construction, the Typhoon class, the largest submarine ever built. McMoneagle had described its construction before those details were confirmed through conventional intelligence sources. Those sessions became the most referenced results in the program's internal evaluations, not because they proved anything definitively, but because they were specific, verifiable, and had no conventional explanation. Stargate existed in an unusual position, too inconsistent to rely upon, yet too intriguing to abandon completely. After more than 2 decades of operation, thousands of sessions have been recorded, and the transcripts filled entire rooms of filing cabinets. In 1995, the CIA commissioned the American Institutes for Research to conduct an independent evaluation. Statistician Dr. Jessica Utz reviewed decades of controlled trials, and her conclusion was unexpected. The data exceeded what probability alone could explain, and that the finding has never been formally retracted. The program's own internal skeptics raised legitimate objections, confirmation bias, underreported failures, and questions about whether the evaluation methods themselves were reliable. These were not fringe objections. They were raised by serious researchers inside the program itself. But the counter-argument was equally specific. Ingo Swann describing Jupiter's ring before Voyager 1 confirmed them. Joseph McMoneagle describing Typhoon-class submarine construction before those details were confirmed through conventional intelligence sources. And Pat Price describing the interior of a Soviet facility that analysts later partially corroborated. These were not vague impressions. They were specific, verifiable, and they arrived before the confirming information was available through conventional means. The skeptics could not fully explain them away. The believers could not fully replicate them on demand. And that tension is exactly why the program lasted 20 years. But a second conclusion proved decisive. The information produced was too vague and too unpredictable to function as reliable intelligence. Reliability is not optional. Project Stargate was officially terminated later that year, not because fraud had been proven, and not because researchers concluded nothing unusual had occurred, but because the phenomenon could not be controlled. When the program closed, not everything stayed buried. Session transcripts, operational summaries, and evaluation reports, thousands of pages, became publicly accessible. Yet large sections remained redacted. Certain tasks were removed entirely, and reference annexes were never released. The final reports did not declare remote viewing impossible, only that it lacked reliability. That distinction remains significant. Government programs are rarely funded for decades without a reason to continue. Whatever researchers observed was enough to justify 20 years of funding, but never enough to depend on. The program closed. Everyone stopped. Several of the program's original viewers continue independently, insisting that what they experienced was real regardless of what the official record said. And in an intelligence work, unanswered questions rarely stay abandoned. They don't disappear. They get reclassified. Project Stargate officially ended in 1995. Facilities closed, personnel was reassigned, and funding was redirected elsewhere. The files were archived, but the conclusions were not a denial. Intelligence agencies rarely abandon ideas they do not fully understand. The records were released. The explanation was not. What's in the files they haven't released yet? Leave your theory in the comments. Archive file 001 closed. Next file pending review.